Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk about how to add and subtract complex numbers. But before we go and start doing that, I want to review what complex numbers are so that you make sure that you get them in the correct form of a plus bi. Alright, so this a value right here, so if I say a plus bi, a is considered to be your real number. Okay? Alright, and this right here, this is considered to be your pure imaginary number. Okay? Now, imaginary numbers, once again, we start with this letter called I, which represents the value known as the square root of -1. Well, technically, just a quick little reminder, you can't take the square root of a -1. It'll tell us, hey, it's a non-real answer. Alright? So the square root of -1 we call I. Okay? So if I say I squared, basically what we're doing is we're taking the square root of -1 and multiplying it to itself. So if we take the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, we get -1. Alright? So I squared ultimately leads us to the value of -1. Once again, remember, if you take a radical, alright, and if I say radical 3 times radical 3, that gives us radical 9, but radical 9, the square root of 9 is just 3. So a radical times another radical will give us the number that's inside of the square root or the radical. Okay, so just a quick little review. So if I say, what is I cubed, that means the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. Now, if you're paying attention during class, you can probably skip through this section because we all know that these right here equal -1. This right here equals I, and -1 times I is -I. Alright? And last but not least, we have I to the power of 4, and then it starts repeating. So if I say I to the power of 4, basically the concept is this. You're basically taking the square root of -1 and multiplying it to itself 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So this product is -1, and this product is -1, and -1 times -1 gets us to 1. So here's, once again, our pattern. We have I squared, we have I cubed, and we have I to the power of 4, and then it repeats. So I, we just know is just I, which is the square root of -1. But I squared is -1, I cubed is -I, and I to the power of 4 is 1. And then it just repeats over and over and over. So that's something you need to have in your journal. Okay? So we know I to the 5th would be the same as I to the 6th would be -1, I to the power of 7 would equal I to the power of 8 would equal 1. It just keeps going on forever. Okay? So for those of you who are trying to remember how to get, let's say, I to the power of 121, what would that equal? We'll do a quick little review here just to start out. Okay? You'll notice these are all going to be multiples of 4. So I to the 16. So anything that's a multiple of 4 we know is going to equal the number 1. So what you could do, just go to the calculator, take 121 divided by 4. We know it's not divisible by 4. It looks like it goes into it 30 times. We have a remainder of 0.25. When you have a remainder of 0.25, when your remainder is, hold on, I'm going to put the R value up here. When you have a remainder of 0.25, you're going to be left with the value of I. When you have a remainder of 0.50, when I say remainder, I'm talking about right here, this number after the decimal. When it's 0.50, you're going to be equal to -1. And when you have a remainder of 0.75, it'll be -I. So this particular problem, I to the power of 121 is just equal to the value of I, because it had a remainder of 0.25 and you're left with I. Now, let's just do one more to make sure. Let's just do a random one. Say 326, just for fun. So if I say 326 divided by 4, press enter. Ooh, what do we have a remainder here? 0.5. So let's take a look at this. Which one is 0.5? 0.5 is this one right here. So I to the power of 326 will equal -1. All right? So all you got to do is just divide it by 4. Now if there's no remainder, that means it's I to the power of, it's going to be in this row right here. So anytime it goes into it evenly, you'll just get the number 1. All right? So did you have to know all of that to do this? No, but that'll be on the quiz, so I want to make sure you know how to do a quick little review because it's been a while since you've dealt with complex numbers. So now all we got to do is just add these together. So basically, you just add all of the real numbers together. I'll highlight the real numbers right here. And then you add all the imaginary numbers together. So we have this imaginary number and this imaginary number. All right? So if we look at this, it's not going to be very complicated. Right here we have 10. So I'll write down 10. I'll do it in green. All right, and we have -22 i's, and it's asking us to add 22 i's. Well, it looks like these will zero out. So we have 0 i's left, but we don't have to put 0 i's. We can just write in the number 10 right here, and we'll be done. Pretty easy. 10. All right, let's go on to the next question. Now, all we're going to do, now just remember, what I did over here, all I was doing was a quick little review of your imaginary numbers. Remember, just work this group of 4 and it just keeps repeating itself. You didn't have to know that for this particular one, but you will need to know it later. All right, take a look at this one. Let's highlight some things. Let's highlight the real numbers. All right, there. We got -13. Ooh, got -3. Then we have 16i, and it's asking us to take away 4i. So what I'd like to do on this is anytime there's a negative right here, imagine there being like a -1 there, and you want to distribute that to both terms. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to rewrite it. We're left with -13 plus 16i. Now I'm going to multiply a -1 times a 3, and that's going to give me a -3. And I'm doing -1 times a 4i, and that gets us -4i. And now I'm just going to combine the like terms. So -13 minus 3 gets me a total of -16. And 16 minus 4 gets me a total of 12. And that's how you add and subtract complex numbers. All right. Just remember, it says it needs to be in this form, which means the real numbers need to go up front, the real in the front, and the imaginary numbers in the back. Otherwise, it'll count you wrong. Okay, so I'll type another one. So we had -16, and we had plus, and I think we had 12i. 12i. All right. Let's do one more. And then we'll call it a day on this particular one. All right, let's take a look at this. Ooh, looks like we got an imaginary number to start out. Okay. Then we got, here we have a real number. And here we have the other imaginary. All right. So it looks like all we're doing is just adding stuff. So here we go. Let's put all our imaginary numbers together. We have -10i. It's asking us to add 8i. So I'll put 8i. All right. Then over here we just have a -40 just sitting there. So if we combine these together, all right, -10i plus 8i. Well, how many more negatives do I have than positives? Looks like I have 2 more. That's why it's -2i. A lot of times what I do is I just subtract these knowing I have more negatives than I do positives. Now, here's what I'm going to show you. If you were to write it in the Khan Academy this way, it would count you wrong because your imaginary numbers need to go in the back. So what we have to do is we have to write it as -40 because that technically is my a value. And then I'm just going to put -2i in the back. Okay? So make sure you put your real numbers up front, imaginary numbers in the back. Negative 40 minus 2y. Alright, and that's how you add and subtract complex numbers. Just make sure you add the real numbers together and add the imaginary numbers together and put it in this form. Have a good day.